George Washington, the first president of the United States, the founding figure who left an indelible mark on history. He passed away in 1799, less than 3 years after leaving the presidency. His death, unexpected, occurred during the third year of John Adams's presidency, his immediate successor. And so, Adams, the second president, found himself in the unprecedented position of leading the nation, becoming the first to assume the office without a living predecessor. Have you ever stopped to think about the impact of such an abrupt transition? How did it shape the future of the country? But to what extent does the death of a president really alter the trajectory of a nation? For nearly 27 years, the death of a former president seemed like a distant event. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe, the giants of American history, each served 8 years, but never saw the death of their predecessors. What did this mean for the political continuity of the United States? Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exclusive content about the history of the U.S. presidents. Stay up to date with interesting facts, stories, and significant moments in American politics. Subscribe now. However, in 1826, the scenario changed dramatically. During John Quincy Adams's second year, the United States lost not only John Adams, but also Thomas Jefferson. And most impressively, they both died on the same day. An almost surreal coincidence that echoes through history to this day. How does a nation cope with the loss of such iconic figures all at once? And what does this mean for the future of a country that just lost two of its greatest founding heroes? Throughout Andrew Jackson's presidency, other major figures, like James Madison and James Monroe, passed away. Monroe, the most recent president, died first, while Madison, the last of the founding fathers, survived 5 more years. His death in 1836 marked the end of an era. The era of the founders had come to a close, and if you think history was already taking its course, prepare yourself. Martin Van Buren's presidency wasn't marked by the deaths of former presidents, but political drama was not far behind. In 1841, William Henry Harrison died after just 31 days in office. Harrison's loss, with 3 predecessors still living, was a shock to the nation. What happens when a newly elected president dies so suddenly? How does this affect the country's destiny? John Tyler assumed office without any other presidential deaths, but the string of losses didn't stop there. James K. Polk's presidency was marked by the deaths of John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, with Jackson, Polk's mentor, being particularly impactful. Imagine the turmoil of seeing your own mentor pass away early in your presidency. Polk, for his part, became the youngest president to die of natural causes, at 53, just 3 months after leaving the White House. With the death of Zachary Taylor, the country suffered another blow. He was the second president to die in office. The political drama seemed relentless. Then, in the following decade, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan took the presidency, and there were no new presidential deaths. But the deaths of Van Buren and Tyler in 1862, early in Abraham Lincoln's presidency, with the nation plunged into the Civil War, brought a reflection. How would the country handle this loss amid the most brutal conflict in its history? Lincoln himself would eventually become the victim of an even greater tragedy. Assassinated just 5 days after the end of the Civil War, he became the first president to be killed in office, an event that would shake the foundations of American democracy. And there's more. Lincoln's presidency was the first to see 3 presidential deaths in a single generation. The succession, the loss, the impact. What do these deaths represent for a young nation, already with a history full of twists and turns? Get ready, as the narrative of power transitions in the United States is a game of unpredictable moves, with echoes of drama, loss, and resilience that shaped the country as we know it. And when we look at the legacy of figures like Ulysses S. Grant, who assumed office in 1869, we see a moment of reflection on what each succession represents, not only for those involved, but for everyone connected to the history of this country. The transition of power continues to demonstrate its ability to shape history, and the presidential deaths continue to resonate in the following generations. Pierce and Johnson, who passed away relatively young, around the age of 60, left office without living predecessors. But if the death of a president can define the fate of a country, what about their post-presidential lives? Fillmore, for example, lived 21 years after leaving the presidency, reaching 74 years. With each term, history becomes more unpredictable. Grant witnessed the death of Pierce in the first months of his presidency and lost Fillmore and Johnson during his second term. What does this mean for a leader who finds himself with no direct connection to the past? How does this affect the public's perception of the presidency? However, the death of James Garfield, assassinated early in his first term, brought a new drama. His premature death reflected a nation in crisis, and Chester A. Arthur had to take office at a time of great tension. The cycle of successions and deaths would continue, and Grover Cleveland, like William McKinley, would have his own chapter marked by tragedy. McKinley, without a doubt, experienced what few administrations had witnessed. His death at the beginning of his second term by assassination was one of the most impactful events in American history. With the rise of Theodore Roosevelt, the country seemed to enter a new era, but the death of presidential figures did not stop there. What happens to a nation when, in the year of his victory, a president loses two of his predecessors? And how does the constant succession with no time to breathe between mourning shape the character of a nation? Cleveland, who experienced the presidency at two distinct moments, survived Roosevelt's reign, but not for long. The cycle of death and transition continued. William Howard Taft, taking office after Roosevelt, found himself not only dealing with the legacy of an iconic predecessor, but also facing the harsh reality of a nation in change. Roosevelt did not die during Taft's term, but he would in the middle of Woodrow Wilson's second term, another president whose legacy would be marked by profound losses. And what can one expect from a nation when President Wilson dies just months after Warren G. Harding? Wilson's death in 1924 ended a cycle, but not without leaving its mark. How does the country react when not just one, but two leaders are lost in such a short time? Calvin Coolidge would have the task of moving forward, but even he could not escape the weight of this sequence of losses. How can someone govern when the echoes of these deaths continue to be heard with every transition? The cycle of presidential successions would continue, but, as always, the deaths of presidents would shape the future of the United States. Even Franklin Roosevelt, who would govern for 12 years, had only one living predecessor during his presidency. This leads us to reflect. To what extent does the death of a president alter the course of a nation? And what is the legacy of all those who lived and died in the office of the presidency? Franklin D. Roosevelt, one of the most emblematic presidents in U.S. history, faced his fourth term with weakened health, and his death in 1945 marked the end of an era. But amid so much suffering and war, how does a nation adjust to unprecedented leadership? Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower would succeed Roosevelt, living in a period without major presidential deaths, but mourning was far from being a closed chapter. Almost 23 years later, in 1963, the death of John F. Kennedy, a brutal and unexpected assassination, deeply shook the country. He was survived by Truman, Eisenhower, and Hoover, a trio of political figures seemingly distant from the tragedy the nation was about to face. The political transition was swift, with Lyndon Johnson assuming immediately, but even the great names of American politics were not immune to the losses yet to come. Hoover would die in the first year of Johnson's presidency. How does this shape the fate of a country when its leadership is intertwined with the death of such influential political figures? From 1933 to 1969, only 3 presidents passed away: Roosevelt, Truman, and Johnson. A surprisingly low number for such a long period, and this would lead to a hiatus in transitions until the drama returned with Richard Nixon. During his 5.5 years in power, the country would witness several deaths of former presidents. The death of Eisenhower, 2 months after Nixon's inauguration, and of Truman in the last months of his first term, brought a darker tone to American politics. It wouldn't be long before Lyndon Johnson would also pass away, less than a month after Truman. Nixon, then, would become the only living president of a generation. Imagine the weight of being the only survivor of so many eras of change. What did that mean for the continuity and stability of American politics? Throughout the next decade, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton would rise to the presidency, with no presidential deaths until Nixon's death in 1994, during Clinton's second term. American politics once again saw a long period without mourning, until Ronald Reagan passed away in 2004, the first presidential death since Nixon and the first in a decade. Gerald Ford would follow, passing away in 2006. During Barack Obama's presidency, there were no further presidential deaths, marking a period of stability. But, as we all know, time waits for no one. George H.W. Bush, the patriarch of the Bush family, would die in 2018 during Donald Trump's presidency. Now, in 2024, Trump is the last president to have lost a predecessor, Bush Sr., and with 6 living presidents, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, the story continues to unfold before our eyes. Each new name is a new opportunity to reflect on the legacies of the past, the leaders who have guided us, and the impact of presidential deaths on the nation's narrative. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to explore more about the U.S. presidents. From George Washington to the most recent ones, we will discuss not only their political careers, but also their personal lives, challenges, and, of course, the place they held in the history of a nation that has never stopped reinventing itself. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exclusive content about the history of U.S. presidents. Stay up to date with interesting facts, stories, and significant moments in American politics. Subscribe now.